Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone, as well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of videos that have been not released to the internet. You can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Dr. Joshua Bowen. Another Patreon member, Michael Baca. He says, hi, Derek. Again, I'm so impressed with all the work you've done recently with so many top-notch scholars, including Dr. Bowen. Here's one quick one. Dr. Bowen, I purchased your recent book. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate the purchase. But have yet to begin reading it. But I'm looking forward to it. My question is there such thing as the biblical interpretation of anything? I put that in parentheses. Christians and Jews have been interpreting the Bible for thousands of years, and they don't seem to agree at all on how to interpret it. Even if we restrict ourselves to what the biblical writers may have intended with certain things like slavery, is it fair to say anything is the biblical interpretation of such and such? This is what fundamentalists do all the time with the Bible. So what do we mean when we say the biblical writers had such and such views on slavery, when it might apply to some texts and not others? Is there still a value in asserting that the biblical writers believe such and such about some topic like slavery, when you might find another writer who has different views? I know this is a complex topic, but curious how you would approach this issue. Appreciate again the great scholarship you are doing and how you are sharing this with Derek. Thanks.
Phenomenal question. And so let me say it this way. Of course, when people say the biblical interpretation, John Collins wrote a book called What Are Biblical Values? And this is getting at the heart of this question, because what are biblical values? Well, I mean, is there such a thing as biblical values? Because this is problematic. Is there this unified voice on any particular biblical topic? So when we think about slavery, as he brought up, is there some unified voice on slavery? And the answer is no, of course not. There's some commonalities that we see. You know, for example, in the Hebrew Bible and the laws, there's always some care for the Hebrew debt slave, right? For the Israelite. But does it manifest itself in the same way? No. Is it to the same level in each law collection? No, it develops. So, you know, what does it mean to have a biblical view on slavery? Well, if you're asking someone what they mean by it, of course, what they mean is their interpretive model. And it's a theological question, I think, more than it is a historical critical question. So what does the Bible say about X?
Sometimes it's wrong to even say it like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what they mean. So if you're asking, as he said, a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, what's the biblical view on homosexuality? For example, what they mean by that, how they will answer that question, is they've taken in all the data points, best case scenario, they've taken in all the data points.
And that never happens, right. I'll just say, but yes.
Whatever amount of data points they've taken in, they have applied their interpretive model to those data points. And in doing so, they have constructed what they believe is the unified biblical response to that question. If you're asking from a historical critical standpoint, well then that's of course what I think he's driving at. There aren't these unified voices. I was thinking about something as you asked the question, and and I'm blanking on it now, which is apparently what I do.
It was a really good question, and I think there's something underlying it. I had this conversation the other night. Tell me if this fits, because this is something that came to mind. I actually spoke to Dale Martin, Dr. Dale Martin.
Oh, wait, sorry.
Please, go ahead.
Just to remind me, it's the Exodus.
Okay.
Exodus traditions. But go ahead,
Nope,
just remind
please.
me.
Nope, you go first.
Okay.
This is your interview.
So Stephen Russell in 2009 wrote a book. Of course, the title escapes me. But essentially what he's doing is he's looking at the earliest references that we have to the Exodus traditions. And he's comparing them and contrasting them. For just this reason, do we have a unified voice, a unified message, a unified tradition on the Exodus? Spoilers, no, right? And what he does is he utilizes prophetic texts and early texts in the Pentateuch that have different geographical origins. It's a really interesting book. And so he looks at he breaks Israel up into its three constituent parts, essentially. You have Cisjordan in the north, so like stereotypical Israel, the northern tribes. Then you have the Transjordanian, Israel, so Cisjordan in the north, Transjordan, and then Judah in the south. And as it turns out, his argument, and I feel like he makes a pretty good case for it, is that, if you look at like Amos and Hosea, you see what's reflected in the northern traditions, early northern traditions. What is it that they thought about the Exodus? And there's no slavery in the northern tradition, right? It seems like the Exodus is more of a northern tradition, but there doesn't seem to be this overt slavery component to it. There's, like a journey. It's maybe not so much an eastward journey. It's just coming up into the land. And there's a military aspect to it. But there's not this component of, slavery and oppression. And I won't go into all the details of which, appears where. I'll be talking about this in volume 2 of the book, in the Exodus chapter. I'll go into this in a little bit of detail, but it's only to say whether Russell is right or wrong about all the different aspects. It does seem clear that there's not a unified early voice on the Exodus tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that in its canonical form, later writers sort of, coalesce and, what's the word that I'm thinking of? Bring together, conflate right. Is the word, and tie these different aspects of the Exodus story together to make this unified Exodus tradition. But if we're thinking about originally, like the earliest attestations that we have, getting back to like Exodus 15 and the Song of the Sea, or the Balaam oracles of Numbers 23 and 24, like these early texts, do they reflect different traditions? And I think it's important to recognize both aspects. I think for our purposes, the earlier traditions are more important from sort of an anti-apologetics perspective.
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean, and let me go to sort of the stereotypical, you had Ronald Hendel on, and I think he talked about this. Think about the pilgrims, right, in the early Thanksgiving stories. There's a difference between what actually happened and how we, through cultural memory, incorporate and reincorporate that into our own practice, into our own traditions. And a good story that's sort of an example of this, I'm feeling very long-winded today.
No, you're fine.
Is the sort of the funny story that I heard about the mother and her daughter who are cooking Thanksgiving dinner, and the mother's showing the young daughter how to cook all the different dishes, and she goes to put the ham in the oven, and she cuts both ends of the ham off before she slides it in. And the daughter, who's like 12 or 13, says, "Mom, why did you cut the ends of the ham off?" And she goes, I don't know. My mother always did it that way. She said, well, it's weird. And she said, you know, let's call grandma and ask her why she did it. So get her on the phone. And I said, hey, Mom, why is it, we're cooking today, why did you cut the ends of the ham off every year before you put it in the oven? And there's sort of silence on the other end of the phone. And she says, you know, I don't really know. My mother always did that. So, I tell you what, I said, get her on a conference call, three-way. And, hey, Nana, I said, why is it that you cut the ends of the ham off every year? And she goes, oh, because I had a really narrow oven. It wouldn't fit in.
Right.
And see, that sort of the development, there's a difference between, the origin and how that tradition gets passed on and carried on, because like it could become, I mean, if you think about it, 2 more generations, maybe that's a real significant, had that origin story not come to light necessarily, maybe a tradition really develops around it where maybe they're cutting the ends of the ham off to give it to a needy family, that doesn't have it, or they're cutting it off because symbolically it's where the worst parts of the ham off, and so it's cutting off for this Thanksgiving, or cutting off, I don't know, the things that we want to do away with so that we can give thanks. I don't know. But the point is that it can carry on its own meaning and its own tradition, completely relevant, independent of, and
that's actually the conversation I had with Del Martin on the phone the other night. And I felt we weren't getting too far in the conversation, because I was like, look, what I'm interested in, if I'm going to interview you, would be trying to ascertain its original context. Now, it'd have been different. I felt like the conversation would have gone a different direction. It would have been different, I think, if he said, look, we can attempt with the canonical and what we have, but to ascertain the actual original context. Have you not watched any of Bart Ehrman's videos? I mean, technically, we don't have the originals. To know what actually has been tampered with, what hasn't, we can assume that we might, and we could play around with maybe what it meant originally in its context, but we can't ascertain that. Instead, what I got, though, was kind of like he sees this as art. And he's like, I think that's the wrong kind of scholarship. This is what his response was. He said, when I approach this, it's like if I told you, hey, what's Mozart's meaning of the something symphony or whatever, the way he approached it is like, what he wrote it for originally doesn't really matter when you're listening to it, why it is good for you and why you like it.
Yeah, reader response.
Right, and I could respect it. Yeah. At the same time, I think what I'm trying to do is also very important for what we're trying to get at.
You know what I would say is that both are right, and what I mean by that is, wouldn't it be great if the only type of interpretive approach today were reader response? So I feel like that would be really great, because reader response approaches to the text, like when you're in Sunday school, we go to an Episcopal church, and I teach Sunday school there sometimes, or I did before the pandemic. And we don't ask questions in there like, okay, what did Isaiah mean? What did 2nd Isaiah mean here in this context? The question is, how does this make you feel? Like, what does this say to you? When you read this gospel, this portion of the gospel, like, how does that make you feel? Well, to the anti-Joel Osteen people, that are like, boo, Joel Osteen, he's too touchy-feely. He's not getting down to the meat of the word. That's true, right? He's not. He's engaging with how it affects people in their day-to-day lives. And that's a valid way to come at the text, because it's how you come at artwork, it's how you come at a painting. The problem is, and so the reason that I think that if only people in like religious circles interpreted things through reader response, I feel like there'd be a lot less of, you should do things my way.
Right. That's not what we see.
Nobody says, this abstract painting, you need to see it the way that I see it. Nobody does that.
Good point.
And I think that if people would say, oh, when Jesus said, let the little children come unto me, or when you see this passage about the Amalekites, the way that I see that, the way that I interpret that, is that like I should be tackling my own demons, my own sin. Hey, boss, like go for it. That's great. Because what reader response does, and this isn't my field, but like what reader response seems to do is to take from a moral standpoint, for example, you have your ethical system already intact. And what you're doing is you're filtering that story through what you know to be good and what you know to be bad. And so if you have that sort of reader response approach, interpretive approach, what you don't do is say, okay, slavery in the Hebrew Bible, you can own foreigners. Well, now that text should address how I think about this morally. It's not really how that works, right? You think, okay, obviously I know slavery is bad. I don't see this as a text that dictates how I should live.
Right.
What I'm doing is how does this speak to me? So I think that both are good. What I think is bad is that the thing that's important is you can't bypass step one and get to step two. I don't think, at least effectively. I think you have to understand, in order to do away with this more fundamentalist approach, taking the text to be, as John Collins wrote in that book, like the thing that you base your values on, which you shouldn't do.
Right. It's harmful, yeah. You
have to understand, to some degree, in its sort of more original context, what it is that those values were, in order to do away with that fundamentalist mindset, I think, because you have to see it for what it is. You have to embrace the fact that the Old Testament endorses slavery before you can say maybe we shouldn't interpret it through that, authorial intent and seeing it as this authoritative text in its original setting, to speak to and engage with my life in that sort of legalistic sense.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think we were kind of talking past each other, but I think it almost sounded like he was saying there was no way to know what Paul meant or what he thought. And there's some possible truth to that in light of the fact that no one has figured out these things, or people are coming at it with biases, with reader intent, and not actually trying to absolutely know what the initial was. And for me, I see value in the initial, since everyone wants to have themselves participate in the narrative.
Even if the value is we can't get to it.
Yeah, even if we don't know for sure.
I think that's important, because if you can get to the step we can't get to it, that automatically does away with that fundamentalist interpretive approach, because they wouldn't say that, right? They would say, of course we can get back to what Paul said.
Means.
Look, let me just hold my Bible up. This is what Paul said. It's like, So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. At the end of the day, I personally want to know the first more. And then I do want to understand how people took it, but then also to say, hey, you say we're all wrong. They say you're wrong.
Exactly.
They say and they're all reading the same thing. Paul says you're all wrong. Yeah. Here's why. You know, like,
I agree with you, by the way. I'm just because if we are talking past each other, I agree with you. I want to talk about this is the reason that
not you and me. I was saying that my conversation with Dr.
I see. Yeah.
I think we were maybe talking past each other. It was a good conversation, but I think he thought, I don't know. I don't want to read too much into maybe what he thought I was thinking. But yeah. And the video I did recently with Joel Baden, where I said, are you reading the Bible? And he's like, you're not really reading the Bible. And what he was doing this, he was like, listen, let's be honest. We don't even know for sure the origin. Yeah. Like we talk about, we have this source and that source, but what was the source that came from, or the oral tradition behind? We don't know.
Yeah, like this is the thing. Jeffrey T. Gay wrote a very lengthy monograph on the Epic of Gilgamesh and how it developed from its earlier Sumerian stories and later Akkadian, and but we can track that because we have the cuneiform tablets. We can go into a museum. I mean, we can't, but I mean, people can go into the museum and get back into the tablet room, as Syriologists can, and pull out those tablet fragments and say, okay, look, here's the Sumerian, one of the copies of Gilgamesh and 🀭, where it talks about Gilgamesh going out and fighting in the cedar forest with the beast out there, and see how that original Sumerian story, which stands by itself, gets brought into the Epic of Gilgamesh, And the Epic of Gilgamesh, of course, pulls in that story, pulls in, Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven. It pulls in all these different, it pulls in the flood story. It does these in such a way to create this canonical epic that has a different meaning than its individual parts.
Right.
But so there are two questions to ask at least. One is what is Sinlake Unini saying? Man, I hope I got that right. The person is attributed to that Epic of Gilgamesh, and what is the thing that he's trying to do? Adding this sort of bracketed literary structure and stringing these originally Sumerian stories together. What is it that he's trying to get at, showing how people aren't immortal and what it means to have immortality? At least how can we get close to it? By having your name continue on and so forth, so on and so forth. How can we see what was originally, what those original stories were that he's pulling from? Well, if we didn't have the Sumerian stories, if they were written on parchment or something, we didn't have them, I mean, we could try to get back at it. Maybe there was an original, story about Gilgamesh fighting the Bull of Heaven with, Ishtar and Inanna. Or maybe there's an original, that like the Gilgamesh and 🀭story was its own independent thing. And these little things tie them together in the epic to string them together, like what Joel Baden was talking about, the European scholarship. But if you didn't have that, you'd have to throw your hands up at the end of the day. We can't really know that specifically. Like we can have reasonable conclusions. So yeah, I mean, I agree completely. That doesn't mean that it's a fool's errand. Right? It doesn't mean that Joel Baden and like Thomas Romer and Konrad Schmidt and all these guys, that they're just what do they say? Like it's not all vanity, as Kohelet would say, right? to try to get back at how did this Pentateuchal text come together, because there's a lot of good insight that you can make. There are a lot of things that you can say from a probabilistic standpoint. This is reasonable to conclude. Just because you can't drive a stake in the ground or draw a line in the sand, so we know how this, it doesn't mean that it's a fool's errand.
Thank you.